Hello everyone, I'm Nizzahon here for the Aether Hub doing another MTG Top 10 list. This week, I'm looking at a certain creature type, which is Elementals, and Simon's also looking at a creature type. In my video, which you're watching now, I'm going to talk about the 10 Elementals in Magic's history that have done the best on the competitive Magic scene, and Simon, of course, is going to look at the lore of Elementals. Elementals are a pretty plentiful creature type. I knew they were sort of around on most planes, but I didn't realize how many Elementals there were until I went in to do the research for this. I thought it would only be a couple hundred cards that I would have to go through to figure out how well they did. Instead, I found out there are 381 Elementals. Now, that sounds like a lot, but to compare it to other creature types, it really is a lot. Elves, for example, only have 333. Zombies have 383. Zombies have 2 more ever than Elementals. And Merfolk only have 161. So just to make some comparisons, there are a lot of Elementals out there. And we're going to look in this list at the 10 Elementals that have performed the best on the competitive Magic scene. Now, before we jump into the top 10, a quick reminder on how I score my lists. Cards receive points depending on how many Grand Prix or Pro Tour Top 8s they've received, with the Pro Tour Top 8 worth twice as much as a Grand Prix Top 8. The cards in this list are then arranged numbers 10 through 1, with the highest score being found at number 1. I also consider Legacy and Vintage Championship events as Pro Tour Top 8 so that those formats can be properly represented in the scores of cards. Now, let's get started. At number 10, we have Verdant Force. Verdant Force was one of the best big creatures in its standard format, and as a result, it was a kind of card that Reanimator decks were interested in cheating into play, and Ramp decks were interested in getting into play quickly. Between having a massive body and the ability to create a sapling during every upkeep, not just your own, he brings a lot of value, and is very difficult to beat if he stays in play for a few turns. He made his debut at Worlds in 1998, putting up 4 top 8s there, and decks built around cheating this elemental into play. In 2001, it started seeing play in Extended 2, primarily in mono-black Reanimator decks, but also in just straight-up ramp decks that could get the mana to play him earlier on in the game. Managed to pick up 3 top 8s in 2 different Extended Pro Tours, New Orleans in 2001 and Houston in 2002. Verdant Force hasn't seen play since 2003, but he's a creature many players have fond memories of just because he could take over the game for you. At number 9, we have one of several Elementals from Lorwyn and Morningtide to make this list. Elementals appear on most planes, but Lorwyn Morningtide has a ton of them, and many of them had the Evoke mechanic, which added some extra flexibility to the cards. Creatures with Evoke all did something when they either entered or left play, and the Evoke cost gave you an option of just getting that trigger and not keeping the creature in play. Mulder is an amazing card because of this flexibility. 5 mana for a 2/2 flyer that draws you 2 cards is great, and in a pinch you can just cast it for its Evoke cost and draw 2 cards for 3 mana, still not too shabby. Mulder first saw play in Block, picking up 5 Grand Prix Top 8s in the format, mostly in Control decks, but also in a Tribal Elemental deck. In Standard, it really shined, though. It was good in Control decks, and 5-color Control decks were a thing in the Standard of its time, but it also showed up in Reanimator decks alongside some other creatures with Evoke, most notably Revelark, who we will talk about later on in this list. But creatures with Evoke were great reanimation targets because you could pitch them into your graveyard early for their Evoke cost, and get them back later, and get the trigger all over again while still holding onto the creature. Mulder never saw play after it rotated out of Standard, but it had a good run there, and is also remembered as one of the most powerful commons in any limited format ever. At number 8, we have Whisperwood Elemental, the newest card on this list. In other words, no cards currently in Standard made this list. Whisperwood Elemental was sweet though. 5 mana for a 4/4 that makes you a 2/2 creature every turn is pretty nice, especially because they weren't all just 2/2 creatures. They were manifest creatures who could have the upside of sometimes flipping into bigger creatures if the face-down card happened to be a creature. That alone would make for a pretty nice value engine, since getting a 2/2 token every turn is no joke, but on top of that, the Elemental came with some extra insurance and could sacrifice itself to make it so that if any of your creatures, other than manifest creatures, die during a turn, you got manifest creatures. This made board sweepers look pretty bad, and Whisperwood Elemental saw a decent amount of play. It exclusively saw play in Standard, and it really only saw play during 1 year in 2015. This is because its biggest home was Devotion to green decks, but when the Devotion of Theros block rotated out of Standard, Whisperwood didn't see much play, though it did find its way into a few Abzan lists as well. At number 7, we return to a card with Evoke. Wispmare was either a 3 mana 1/3 with flying who blew up an enchantment, or it could blow up an enchantment for a single white mana and then go to the graveyard. This was a very efficient cost to blow up enchantments. Both Lorwyn Block and Lorwyn Standard had the very powerful enchantment Bitter Blossom, and as a result, Wispmare found its way into a lot of decks as an answer to this. This included a few Elemental Tribal decks, but it also included Kithkin and Merfolk. In Standard, it saw play in Revelark decks. Once again, we'll get to Revelark eventually. And also in black-white token lists and 5-color control decks. It also picked up 1 Grand Prix top 8 in Extended in a blue-white control deck. The efficiency and flexibility that Wisperwood offers has even allowed it to see play in Vintage, Magic's most powerful format, where it's picked up 2 Vintage Championship top 8s in dredge decks that could use their graveyard as a toolbox, and Wisperwood was a nice tool to have in there. At number 6, we continue with another Evoke creature, Ingot Chewer. Very similar to Wisperwood, the Chewer could very efficiently deal with one type of permanence, artifacts. Unlike Mulder and Wisperwood, though, it didn't see any play in block, and it only picked up 1 Pro Tour top 8 in Standard. These were formats that just didn't have enough problem artifacts to make Ingot Chewer worth running. Formats with more artifacts are where this guy ended up chewing up the most ingots, though. There were some more problem artifacts in Extended, where Affinity was part of the metagame, and he saw a bit more play there. The same is true in Modern, where it has seen play primarily in Living Index, where it was especially good because you could use it in the early game to blow up a problem artifact like a Cranial Plating, and then in the late game you could cast Living In, blow up your opponent's board, and get back your Ingot Chewer to perhaps kill one of the artifact creatures your opponent had in their graveyard that came back. It is still seeing play in 2017 in Living Index. Like Wisperwood, Ingot Chewer has been good enough to see play in Vintage because of its efficiency, and also because Vintage is a format loaded with powerful artifacts like the Moxen. It has picked up a whopping 9 Vintage Championship Type 8s, primarily in dredge decks. At number 5, we continue with yet another elemental with Evoke, this time Cloud Thresher. The Thresher was a very efficient creature, even when you just cast it conventionally. Having Flash and Reach and killing any small flyers in the sky with a 7/7 body is a pretty insane rate, but Evoke gave it added flexibility, where if your opponent was massing flyers earlier in the game, you could take them out of the sky by evoking Thresher, which you could do at instant speed, and he would then be brought out of your graveyard later in the game one way or another. He saw a ton of play in block in a variety of decks. This is because the block format was dominated by fairies, and Cloud Thresher could, well, thresh all of them. This means it showed up in sideboards in some decks you wouldn't even think about, like Merfolk, because it was such a good card against fairies. The Standard format also featured fairies, so it continued to see play there, in ramp decks, elf decks, and Doran the Siege Tower decks primarily. The Thresher never quite made a top 8 after it rotated out of Standard, but it killed a ton of fairies while it was there. At number 4, we have Revelark, who I've been promising to get to eventually, and this is a creature I've mentioned multiple times on this list, because this is a creature with Evoke that worked well with other creatures with Evoke. Unlike the others we've seen, Revelark does something when it dies, not when it comes into play, and its Evoke cost is actually higher than its converted mana cost, since if you had a lesser converted mana cost for Evoke, it would be pretty busted. Revelark could get back other elementals on this list, like Wisperwood and Mulder when it died, and in the meantime, it was a big beater in the air, one that if you killed would just get back some serious value from the graveyard. Unlike some of the others on this list, Revelark didn't catch on in the block format and only managed a couple of Grand Prix top 8s there. In Standard, though, an eponymous deck was built that put up some impressive finishes, including 3 Grand Prix top 8s at Grand Prix Shizuoka in 2008, and 3 Pro Tour top 8s at Pro Tour Hollywood in the same year. The deck was filled with 2-power creatures with enter the battlefield abilities who could be abused when you brought them back with your Revelark, including some of the elementals we mentioned, but also including Venser, Shaper Servan, and Aven Riftwatcher. Eventually, the value of Revelark was realized by other decks too, so he was added to decks that weren't necessarily built around Revelark, like Merfolk and Kithkin, where the enter the battlefield triggers couldn't be abused as much, but getting back 2 creatures from your graveyard when the Revelark died was still worth it. Revelark also saw play in Extended, albeit at only 1 Pro Tour where it managed 3 top 8s, 2 in Doran decks and 1 in a Merfolk deck at Pro Tour Amsterdam in 2010. It also saw play in Modern, most famously in Birthing Pod decks where it could be used to bring back your dead combo pieces like Malira or Murderous Redcap. Birthing Pod eventually got banned though, and as a result, Revelark hasn't seen much play since then, though decks using Collected Company and Court of Calling in place of the pod have started running Revelark sometimes too. At number 3, we have Voice of Resurgence, a card that is the bane of control players everywhere. This mana 2/2 cranks out a creature token every time one of your opponents plays a spell during your turn, and it's not like it's a sapperling or something, it's a creature with power and toughness equal to the number of creatures you control, so at worst it'll be a 1/1, and usually it's bigger than that. The Voice also makes a token when it dies, so it is a hard creature to kill effectively, as he often forces you to at least 2-for-1 yourself. Basically, he's the ideal card for an aggro deck against control. At Pro Tour Dragon's Maze, the block Pro Tour, it picked up 2 top 8s in Selesnya aggro decks. This would primarily be where it saw play in Standard 2, though it also found its way into Naya aggro decks, and even into some control builds like Junk and 4-color control, where the value it could give you was good enough for even a control deck to run it. It was strong enough that if you had green and white mana in your deck in that Standard format, you were probably playing it. In Modern, it also sees play. In the early days, this was in Birthing Pod decks, but more recently, it has been in Collected Company decks, where Voice of Resurgence is one of the more powerful things you can play off of Collected Company. At number 2, we have Fulminator Mage, a 2/2 that can destroy lands, though they do have to be non-basic. The majority of decks in the formats it sees play in basically always have a non-basic land in play, so it's basically always going to blow up a land. Plus, it can block an attack when it needs to. It didn't actually do much in the standard of its time, picking up only 1 Grand Prix Top 8 in 2009, and it also only picked up 1 Grand Prix Top 8 in Extended in 2010 in Travis Wu's Living In deck, where, similar to how it works with some of the other creatures we've talked about on this list who go to the graveyard, you basically got to blow up 2 of your opponent's lands with a single Fulminator Mage. Modern is where it has done the most work, though, as there are non-basic lands everywhere. It first debuted in the format in Birthing Pod decks and has seen play in the modern version of Living In, but has also seen play in Jund, and probably the most play in Jund. More recently, it has seen play in decks packing Collected Company, as it is a pretty good hit off of the card, and it also has a home in the sideboard of Death's Shadow Zoo decks. It will only build on its lead on the other cards on this list, since it still sees such consistent play in Modern. Even just so far in 2017, the Mage has added 12 points to its score, which was actually enough to tie it with the number 1 card on this list. But I used Pro Tour Top 8s as a tiebreaker, so for now, the number 1 spot is safe, though I think it will be claimed by Fulminator Mage in the near future. So what do we have at number 1? It is Shriekmaw, which is probably the best of all of the Evoke creatures, although Revelark probably has an argument. Basically casting Terror when it comes into play, Shriekmaw is powerful as a 3/2 with Fear that blows up a creature when it comes into play, and like all Evoke creatures, you can evoke it earlier in the game if you have to. As with most Evoke creatures, this worked especially well alongside reanimation effects, which would give you 2 shots at this powerful Enter the Battlefield ability. The card was immediately recognized as powerful, and as a result, it put up crazy numbers in Lorwyn Morning-type block, even finding its way into Fairy decks, despite the fact that this elemental isn't actually a fairy. In Standard, it saw play in makeshift mannequin decks, who were interested in reanimating the Maw and other creatures with Evoke to get their triggers twice, but has also seen play in Elf decks, Fairies, and Black Ring control decks. Saw some play in Extended 2 in Living End and in Jund. In Modern, it saw play in Birthing Pod and Living In. In Pod, it was a great card to tutor up when you needed to kill a creature, and in Living In, you could use it early to kill an opponent's creature, and then later on in the game, get it back with Living In and do it all over again. And it is still seeing play in Living In. The question is whether it can keep its lead over the Fulminator Mage, who's in hot pursuit, though. That does it for this MTG Top 10. Later in the week, Simon will cover the lore of elementals across the multiverse of magic, so keep an eye out for that. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it. If you have any suggestions for future Top 10s, post them in the comments below. And if you want to make sure you catch more of my Top 10s, you can subscribe here, and also check out my channel, Nizzahon Magic, where I do a Top 10 list each and every week. Thanks for watching.